we are going to do the chapter The Mughals 16th to 17th century. Earlier we have done the chapter Delhi 12th to 15th century. So there we have read about from 12th to 15th century, and here we'll be reading from 16th to 17th century. So let's start. Ruling as large a territory as the Indian subcontinent with such a diversity of people and cultures was an extremely difficult task for any ruler to accomplish in the Middle Ages. Quite in contrast to their predecessors, the Mughals created an empire and accomplished what had hitherto seemed possible for only short periods of time. From the latter half of the 16th century, they expanded their kingdom from Agra and Delhi until in the 17th century they controlled nearly all of the subcontinent. They imposed structures of administration and ideas of governance that outlasted their rule, leaving a political legacy that succeeding rulers of the subcontinent could not ignore. Today, the Prime Minister of India addresses the nation on Independence Day from the ramparts of the Red Fort in Delhi, the residence of the Mughal emperors. So, children, please remember the Prime Minister of India addresses the nation on Independence Day from the ramparts of the Red Fort in Delhi, the residence of Mughal emperors. So, if you will be asked what is the name of the residence of the Mughal emperor, so you have to write Red Fort and Delhi. And here you can also see this figure 1, the Red Fort. So this is the residence of Mughal emperors. Now who were the Mughals? Now let us know about who were the Mughals. So the Mughals were descendants of two great lineages of rulers. From their mother's side, they were descendants of Genghis Khan, who died in 1227, the Mongol ruler who ruled over parts of China and Central Asia. So let's repeat about Genghis Khan. Who was Genghis Khan? Genghis Khan was a Mongol ruler who ruled over parts of China and Central Asia. So this is about Genghis Khan. Now from their father's side, they were the successors of Timur, who died in 1404. And who was Timur? Timur was the ruler of Iran, Iraq and modern day Turkey. So who is Timur? Timur is the ruler of Iran, Iraq and modern day Turkey. However, the Mughals did not like to be called a Mughal or a Mongol. This was because Genghis Khan's memory was associated with the massacre of innumerable people. It was also linked with the Uzbeks. Now, who were Uzbeks? Uzbeks were their Mongol competitors. On the other hand, the Mughals were proud of the Timurid ancestry, not least of all because their great ancestor had captured Delhi in 1390. They celebrated their genealogy pictorially, each ruler getting a picture made of Timur and himself. Now, Mughal military campaigns. We will study about Babur here. So, Babur, the first Mughal emperor, 1526 to 1530. Now, you have to remember that Babur was the first Mughal emperor and he ruled from 1526 to 1530. Succeeded to the throne of Fargana in 1494 when he was only 12 years old. He was forced to leave his ancestral throne due to the invasion of another Mongol group, the Uzbeks. After years of wandering, he seized Kabul in 1504. Then in 1526, he defeated the Sultan of Delhi, Ibrahim Lodi, at Panipat and captured Delhi and Agra. So children, you have to remember that he defeated the Sultan of Delhi in 1526, Ibrahim Lodi, at Panipat and captured Delhi and Agra. Mughal traditions of succession. The Mughals did not believe in the rule of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited his father's estate. Instead, they followed the Mughal and Timurid custom of Kopar Senuri inheritance, or a division of the inheritance amongst all the sons. Now, which do you think is a fairer division of inheritance, primogeniture or Kopar Senuri? So, according to me, Kopar Senuri is a better option, but you people can also tell your views in the comment section. Now, next, Mughal relations with other rulers. The Mughal rulers campaigned constantly against rulers who refused to accept their authority. But as the Mughals became powerful, many other rulers also joined them voluntarily. The Rajputs are a good example of this. Many of them married their daughters into Mughal families and received high positions, but many resisted as well. The Sisodia Rajputs of Mewar refused to accept Mughal authority for a long time. So who are the people who refused to accept the Mughal authority? Were the Sisodia Rajputs of Mewar. Once defeated, however, They were honorably treated by the Mughals, given their lands Watan back as assignments, Watan Jagir. The careful balance between defeating but not humiliating their opponents enabled the Mughals to extend their influence over many kings and chieftains. But it was difficult to keep this balance all the time. Now, please come back to the last page again and let's read this pink box on the right hand side. Mughal marriages with the Rajputs. The mother of Jahangir was a Kachwaha princess, daughter of the Rajput ruler of Amber, modern day Jaipur. So Jahangir's mother was a Kachwaha princess, daughter of the ruler of Amber, modern day Jaipur. The mother of Shahjahan was a Rathore princess, daughter of the Rajput ruler of Marwar, Jodhpur. Okay, now come to the next page again and let's read the new topic, Mansabdars and Jagirdars. As the empire expanded to encompass different regions, the Mughals recruited diverse bodies of people. Now, when the empire expands, the people need more people to work. Okay, so from a small nucleus of Turkish nobles to Ranis, they expanded to include Iranians, Indian Muslims, Afghans, Rajputs, Marathas, and other groups. Those who joined Mughal service were enrolled as Mansabdars. The term Mansabdar referred to an individual who holds a Mansab, meaning a position or a rank. So you have to learn this. If you will get a question, write a short note on Mansabdar. So you have to start your answer from here. The term Mansabdar refers to an individual who holds a Mansab, meaning a position or a rank. It was a grading system used by the Mughals to fix number 1 rank, number 2 salary, and number 3 military responsibilities. So rank and salary were determined by a numerical value called Zat. The higher the Zat, the more prestigious was the noble's position in court and the larger his salary. So till here you have to learn about it. If you will get a question, write a short note on Mansabdar. The Mansabdar's military responsibilities required him to maintain a specified number of Sawar or cavalrymen. The Mansabdar bought his cavalrymen for review, got them registered, their horses branded, and then received money to pay them as salary. Mansabdars received their salaries revenue assignments called Jagirs, which was somewhat like Iktas. But like Muktis, most Mansabdars did not actually reside in or administer their Zagirs. They only had rights to the revenue of their assignments, which was collected for them by the servants while the Mansabdars themselves served in some other part of the country. Now let's read Zat ranking, the pink box on the left hand side. Nobles with a Zat of 5,000 were ranked higher than those of 1,000. In Akbar's reign, there were 29 Mansabdars with a rank of 5,000 Zat. By Aurangzeb's reign, the number of Mansabdars increased to 79. Would this have meant more expenditure for the state? Yes, obviously this have meant more expenditure for the state because if there are more people, you have to give them salaries also. Now the next page. In Akbar's reign, these Jagirs were carefully assessed so that their revenues were roughly equal to the salary of the Mansabdar. By Aurangzeb's reign, this was no longer the case and the actual revenue collected was often less than the granted sum. There was also a huge number in the increase in the number of Mansabdars, which meant a long wait before they received a Jagir. These and other factors created a shortage in the number of Jagirs. As a result, many Jagirdars tried to extract as much revenue as possible while they had a Jagir. Aurangzeb was unable to control these developments in the last years of his reign and the peasantry therefore suffered tremendously. So here in this paragraph a question can arise that what were the difference between the Akbar's revenue system and Aurangzeb's revenue system. So you can give this answer from here till here. In Akbar's reign, these Jagirs were carefully assessed so that the revenues were roughly equal to the salary of the Mansabdar. By Aurangzeb's reign, this was no longer the case, and the actual revenue collected was often less than the granted sum. There was also a huge increase in the number of Mansabdars, which meant a long wait before they receive a Jagir. What is Jagir? Jagir is a land. These and other factors created a shortage in the number of Jagirs. As a result, many Jagirdars tried to extract as much revenue as possible while they had a Jagir. Aurangzeb was unable to control these developments in the last years of his reign, and the peasantry therefore suffered tremendously. Now you can see this figure 4, a Mansabdar on march with his Sawars. Then figure 5. Details from a miniature from Shah Jahan's reign depicting corruption in his father's administration. A corrupt officer receiving a bribe here in this picture. A current officer is receiving a bribe. Then in this picture number 2, a tax collector punishing poor peasants. Okay? You can see this clearly. Now Zabt and Zamindars. The main source of income available to Mughal rulers was tax on the produce of the peasantry. In most places, peasants paid taxes through the rural elites, that is, the headman or the local chieftain. The Mughals used one term, zamindars, to describe all intermediaries, whether they were local headmen of villages or powerful chieftains. Akbar's revenue minister, the Todalmar. Now you can be asked this question, who was Akbar's revenue minister? So Akbar's revenue minister was Todalmar. Carried out a careful survey of crop yields, prices and areas cultivated for a 10-year period, 1570 to 1580. On the basis of this data, tax was fixed on each crop in cash. Each province was divided into revenue circles with its own schedule of revenue rates for individual crops. This revenue system was now known as Zabt. Now if you will get a question that what is Zabt, so you have to write this answer from here till here. We'll repeat. Akbar's revenue minister Todalmar carried out a careful survey of crop yields, prices and areas cultivated for a 10-year period, 1570 to 1580. On the basis of this data, tax was fixed on each crop in cash. Each province was divided into revenue circles with its own schedule of revenue rates for individual crops. This revenue system was now known as Zabt. Now next, it was prevalent in those areas where Mughal administrators could survey the land and keep very careful accounts. This was not possible in provinces such as Gujarat and Bengal. In some areas, the zamindar exercised a great deal of power. The exploitation by Mughal administrators could drive them to rebellion. Sometimes, zamindars and peasants of the same caste allied in rebelling against Mughal authority. These peasant revolts challenged the stability of the Mughal Empire from the end of the 17th century. Now let's read about Akbarnama and Ain-e-Akbari, the pink box. This is a very important question and it normally comes in the exam. So Akbarnama and Ain-e-Akbari. Akbar ordered one of his close friends and courtiers, Abul Fazl, to write a history of his reign. Abul Fazl wrote a 3-volume history of Akbar's reign, titled Akbarnama. The first volume dealt with Akbar's ancestors and the second volume recorded the events of Akbar's reign. The third volume is the Ain-e-Akbari. It deals with Akbar's administration, household, army, the revenues, and the geography of his empire. It also provides rich details about the traditions and culture of the people living in India. The most interesting aspect about the Ain-e-Akbari is its rich statistical detail about things as diverse as crops, yields, prices, wages, and revenue. So this is a very important question, and that is why I am repeating it again. Akbar ordered one of his close friends and courtiers, Abul Fazl, to write a history of his reign. Abul Fazl wrote a 3-volume history of Akbar's reign, titled Akbarnama. So the first volume dealt with Akbar's ancestors, and the second volume recorded the events of Akbar's reign. The third volume is the Ain-e-Akbari. Now what is Ain-e-Akbari? Ain-e-Akbari deals with Akbar's administration, household, army, the revenues and the geography of his empire. It also provides rich details about the traditions and culture of the people living in India. The most interesting aspect about the Ain-e-Akbari is its rich statistical details about things as diverse as crops, yields, prices, wages and revenues. Now in figure 6, you can see Akbar receiving the Akbarnama from Abul Fazl. Now let's read this pink box. Noor Jahan's influence in Jahangir's court. Mehrunisa married the Emperor Jahangir in 1611 and received the title Noor Jahan. She remained extremely loyal and supportive to the monarch. As a mark of honor, Jahangir struck silver coins bearing his own titles on one side and on the other the inscription struck in the name of Queen Begum Noor Jahan. The adjoining document is an order farman of Noor Jahan. The square seal, this is the square seal. The square seal states command of a most sublime and elevated majesty Noor Jahan Padshah Begum. The round seal, this one. The round seal states by the son of Shah Jahangir. She became as brilliant as the moon. May Noor Jahan Padshah be the lady of the age. Now the yellow box, next page, Sulh-e-Kul. Jahangir Akbar's son described his father's policy of Sulh-e-Kul in the following words. Now what is Sulh? Sulh means dosti karna. As in the wide expanse of the divine compassion, there is room for all classes and the followers of all creeds. So, in his imperial dominions, which on all sides were limited only by the sea, there was a room for the professors of opposite religions and for beliefs, good and bad, and the road to intolerance was closed. Sunnis and Shias met in one mosque, and Christians and Jews in one church to pray. He consistently followed the principle of universal peace, means Sulh-e-Kul. So, what do you mean by Sulh-e-Kul? Universal peace. Next topic, the Mughal Empire in the 17th century and after. The administrative and military efficiency of the Mughal Empire led to great economic and commercial prosperity. International travelers describe it as a fabled land of wealth. But these same visitors were also appalled at the state of poverty that existed side by side with greatest opulence. The inequalities were glaring. Documents from the 20th year of Shah Jahan's reign inform us that the highest ranking Mansabdars were only 445 in number out of a total of 8,000. This small number, a mere 5.6% of the total number of Mansabdars, received 61.5% of the total estimated revenue of the empire as salaries for themselves and their troopers. The Mughal emperors and their Mansabdars spent a great deal of their income on salaries and goods. This expenditure benefited the artisans and peasantry who supplied them with goods and produce. But the scale of revenue collection left very little for investment in the hand of primary producers, the peasant and the artisan. The poorest among them lived from hand to mouth, and they could hardly consider investing in additional resources, tools, and supplies to increase productivity. The wealthier peasantry and artisanal groups, the merchants and the bankers profited in this economic world. So the wealthier peasantry was the merchants and the bankers who profited in this economic world. The enormous wealth and resources commanded by the Mughal elite made them an extremely powerful group of people in the late 17th century. As the authority of the Mughal emperor slowly declined, his servants emerged as powerful centers of power in the regions. They constituted new dynasties and held the command of provinces like Hyderabad and Awadh. Although they continued to recognize the Mughal emperor in Delhi as their master, by the 18th century the provinces of the empire had consolidated their independent political identities. Here we come to the end of this chapter. I will upload the exercise in the next video. Thank you.